Tonight, you're not chasing glory in a longship legend. You're sitting close to the edge of a quiet sea, and the world is doing that slow thing it does when it thinks nobody is watching. Before you fall asleep, you'll drift through a raid that returns with more portable value than poetry. You'll see how roots and ports turn violence into a routine, and you'll watch a small sound one coin. One chain ring connect to a system big enough to move whole lives without raising its voice. 3 details to hold gently: oars hushing in black water, cold metal answering itself in a chain, a market bell sounding once, then stopping. Something nearby keeps time the bell slow and obedient, and if your breathing starts to follow it, that's perfect. Inhale 4, exhale 6. If nights like this keep you company, you can softly subscribe only if you feel like it. And if you share where and what time you're listening from, maybe that little bell will remember you there. Because tonight's story doesn't begin with axes, shields, or heroic speeches. It begins with a scale, a hand that knows how to weigh silver, and the quiet moment when a human life is treated like something you can count quickly. You might not think the clink of a single coin could tell you more about Vikings than a whole saga full of heroic speeches, but it can. Sometimes the loud part of history is just the surface, and the quiet part is what keeps returning, like a tide that doesn't need applause. Picture dark water that barely moves, or is easing through it without complaint, and somewhere far ahead a small bell sounding once, then stopping, as if even the bell has decided not to overdo it. But a lot of Viking wealth was not bright at all. And quietly converted into whatever a port town happened to want that week. Silver, especially, becomes a kind of sleepy heartbeat in the Viking world. Not always minted neatly into official coins, but chopped, bent, weighed, tested with teeth and knives, and treated as a language that didn't require translation. And some of that silver did not come from mines. It came from movement of goods, of promises, of people. If you look at the past through the eyes of a ledger, you notice something unsettling but also strangely ordinary. People can be written down as cargo, and once something is cargo, it can be counted quickly. Names blur, categories sharpen. A ship's hold can contain furs, walrus ivory, timber, and then, in the same practical breath, living human beings treated like inventory. Breathe in for 4, out for 6, and notice how glory is loud, but logistics is what keeps returning. The strangest part, in a quiet way, is how a system can feel normal to the people using it, simply because it has routines. Ransom, resale, and forced labor form a grim triangle that makes violence profitable, even when no land is taken. A captive could become a bargaining chip, a repayment, a gift that bought loyalty without anyone having to mint more coins. It links villages to courts, and courts to ports, and ports to routes that can be traveled again and again until the route itself feels like a piece of furniture and the world always there, always ready. This is the kind of history that doesn't need a villain with a theatrical laugh. It needs a scale, a price, and enough people willing to pretend the scale is the only thing that matters. And it's worth saying softly, without turning it into spectacle. When humans are turned into currency, the cruelty isn't only in the act itself, but in how quickly it can become routine. Now let the scene shift gently, the way a boat shifts when it enters a wider stretch of river. Routes mattered. Rivers were highways, and the idea is almost soothing until you remember what can travel on a highway. Waterways let people move quickly, quietly, and at scale. A boat can outrun a rumor, especially in a world where news moves by mouth and foot and weather. Captives could be moved along these routes from inland places toward the sea, and the stops along the way were often practical. Food, repairs, negotiations. Each stop was also a chance for things to change hands without too many witnesses, because witnesses are what turn a transaction into a problem. And then, when the boat reaches a port town, the quietness changes flavor. Port towns are busy in daylight. They have guards. They have scribes. They have people whose job is to notice. Transactions happen close to scales and measures and official-looking faces, because official-looking faces make commerce feel safer for the buyers, even when what's being bought should never have been for sale in the first place. It helps, if your mind wants specifics, to imagine a market day not as one single square with a big sign reading "slave market," because history is rarely that tidy. Sometimes the market is a dock. Sometimes it's a courtyard. Sometimes it's a house with a locked back room, the kind of room that is technically part of a home and yet treated like a storage space. Prices shift with age, health, skills, and the buyer's purpose: farm work, household work, prestige. Language matters because language is how you turn a person into a category. Interpreters become part of the machinery. People are renamed. Quick judgments are made about who could be useful, which is one of those words that sounds harmless until you notice what it is being used to justify. And perhaps the most chilling detail is not the shouting, because there isn't always shouting. It's how ordinary it can feel. Voices bargaining, someone counting coins, someone else pretending this is just another purchase like wool or grain. The same tide that carries timber and salt and barrels of fish can also carry lives, quietly bundled into trade. Let the story drift forward again, away from the port and into the after, because the sale, in historical terms, is not an ending. It's a beginning of a different kind of life, one that is often written into the daily structure of households and farms. In Norse societies, enslaved people were often called thralls, and the word itself feels blunt and heavy, like it doesn't want to soften. Thralls did labor that kept farms, boats, and homes running. Some tasks were heavy and public work you could see from a distance. Others were intimate and invisible, where control didn't need shouting because the control was built into routine. Status could be written into everything: where you slept, what you ate, who could interrupt your time, who was allowed to touch your belongings, which might be nothing or might be a few small objects that carried the entire idea of mine. Even in a culture that loves stories about honor, there were plenty of lives where honor was not part of the deal. And in a sleepy voice, we can acknowledge that without making it dramatic. Sometimes the worst systems are the ones that don't require constant violence to keep going, because habit does the work for them. If you want a gentle micro-hook to keep your attention lightly engaged, notice how law appears here like slow weather. Freedom, when it came, often arrived as a legal change, not as a sudden moral awakening. A person might be freed and become part of the community, but the path depended on owners, money, luck, and the willingness of the surrounding society to accept the change as real. Manumission existed, but it had limits. A freed person might still carry marks, names, obligations, memories of who once held authority. Laws and customs could recognize freedom while still keeping someone at the edge of full belonging, like a door that is technically open but still guarded by a look. Even when a life improved, the system stayed in place, ready to fill the gap with someone else. This is one reason historians speak cautiously, not because they're trying to be vague, but because the past is full of partial changes that feel like relief to one person and like continuity to the system. And now, slowly, we arrive at the record, the part where the world tries to leave clues, and we try to read them without pretending they're complete. How do we know what we know? Not by hearing 1,000 individual voices preserved perfectly, because history rarely preserves voices that were treated as property. That absence is itself part of the violence. So we read shadows. We read what was built, what was bought, and what was made profitable. We find weights and measures, bits of silver, chains, locks, traded goods. We read laws that name categories of people and define what can be done to them, which is a cold kind of evidence because it's so precise. We read sagas that sometimes speak around the topic rather than into it, because saga writers had their own goals and their own silences. We read foreign chronicles that notice trade routes because captives appear far from home, renamed and resettled, and an outsider's surprise becomes a clue. Archaeology hints. Legal texts state, stories circle. And when you put all of that together, you get a picture that is clear in structure and blurry in faces, which is one of the hardest kinds of clarity to carry. So here is a bedtime oath for hard history, spoken softly so it doesn't turn into a performance. Keep facts in one jar: routes, ports, prices, laws. Keep myth in another: ships, heroes, clean stories with clean edges. If a tale feels too glorious, look for the labor underneath it and ask, gently but clearly, who paid the hidden cost. You don't need to do it with anger to make it real. You can do it the way you notice something small in a room and can't unnotice it. Tomorrow, hold one detail gently but clearly. A market bell is still a bell, even when it sells people. A scale is still a scale, even when it weighs cruelty into profit. A ledger is still a ledger, even when it turns a life into a line item. The water darkens. The dock quiets. Coins sleep in a purse the way stones sleep at the bottom of a river, heavy and unbothered. And the night, if we let it, refuses to romanticize. It simply settles around the facts and the silences, and it lets you drift. Not because the story is resolved, but because the telling can soften at the edges like waves easing against wood again and again, until your mind stops gripping and the history still real becomes distant enough for sleep. You might not expect a tiny, slightly greasy leather pouch to explain a whole economy, but in the Viking Age it can. Not the kind of pouch that looks heroic in a museum display either. Just a small pocket of everyday practicality, the sort of thing that holds a few bent silver fragments, a couple of little weights, and the quiet awareness that money doesn't have to look pretty to work. Somewhere near a shoreline, oars dip and lift without splashing too much, and somewhere inland a metal scale folds shut with the tenderness of a book being closed mid-sentence. And before we drift further, a soft question you can answer only to yourself. Where and what time are you listening from? When people picture Viking wealth, they often imagine clean, shiny treasure, stacked like a fantasy reward. But Viking silver was frequently messy. It was hacked, clipped, bent, and folded, because what mattered was not the face on the coin, but the weight in the hand. A coin could be a coin for about 5 minutes, and then it could become a strip, a triangle, a neat little silver sliver that fit better in a bag. There's something strangely calming about that level of practicality, like watching someone reorganize a drawer with complete confidence. The Vikings didn't always treat money as a symbol. They treated it as a substance. Silver was a material you could test, cut, and count without needing a king's portrait to approve of it. It's the sleepy truth behind a lot of trade. The glamorous part is loud, but the measuring part is what keeps returning. If you've ever handled loose change and thought, very briefly, I should sort this, you've brushed against the same feeling. Except in the Viking world, sorting could mean literally breaking value into smaller, more flexible pieces. This is where hack silver comes in, which sounds like a modern computer crime, but is really just a calm description of chopped silver used as currency. People carried bits of arm rings, chopped ingots, torn up coins, and sometimes jewelry that had been demoted into payment. The point wasn't to be elegant. The point was to be spendable. If you can imagine a marketplace where the price of something is roughly this much, metal, you can imagine why a person would want their money to be easily divisible. It's hard to buy a small item with a large ring unless you are comfortable with someone taking a bite out of your jewelry, and most people, even in the Viking Age, preferred their biting to happen to food. If you're still awake by the time I start describing tiny weights the size of peas, feel free to subscribe. But honestly, don't strain yourself. Vikings had ravens in stories and accountants in reality, and neither group was especially gentle about reminders. The quiet genius of hack silver is that it turns money into a kind of shared agreement about matter. If enough people agree that silver is valuable, then the exact shape stops being important. You don't need matching coins. You just need trust in the metal, and trust in the person weighing it, and trust in the set of weights being used, which is where the pocket scale becomes the true star of this sleepy story. Small scales could be carried, folded, and used wherever trade happened, which is almost anywhere people meet. A marketplace stall, a dock, a farmhouse doorway, a boat pulled up onto a riverbank. The scale itself is not dramatic. It is two little pans and a beam and a quiet sense of judgment, but it is also, in a way, the engine of an entire system. The scale says, this is fair, and everyone tries very hard to believe it, because commerce is exhausting when you have to argue about fairness every time you buy a piece of cloth. Those weights, the ones that sit in a pouch like sleeping insects, are oddly charming in their plainness. Some are little cubes, some are rounded, some are decorated because humans can't resist decorating the tools they use daily, even when those tools are meant to be boring. And the weights had to be consistent enough that people didn't just start throwing them into rivers out of frustration. In some places, weights follow systems that link back to broader trade networks, which is a gentle reminder that Viking life was not only raids and shouting. It was also a web of routes and exchanges that connected Scandinavia to the British Isles, to the Frankish world, and far beyond, stretching into the lands where silver coins called dirhams were minted in the Islamic world. It's one of the quietest surprises. You can find Arabic coins in Viking contexts, sometimes cut up, sometimes bent, sometimes treated like raw material rather than sacred currency. The coin traveled a long way to become a triangle in someone's pouch. History is full of long journeys that end in a very small, unglamorous form. If your mind likes small, pointless details, here's one. Some Viking Age dirhams were found folded like someone tried to make them easier to store, or like they wanted to test whether a coin could be convinced to behave like fabric. Folding money feels modern, but it's also ancient. And it's a reminder that people have always had pockets and always wanted those pockets to be manageable. Imagine a person at a market, smoothing a folded coin with a thumb, not thinking about empires or religion or distant mints, only thinking, will this weigh enough for the thing I want? In that moment, the whole world shrinks down to weight and desire, which is honestly a very human way to live. Now let the scene drift toward the places where this weighing happened, because trade needs stages, even when the stage is just a plank laid over mud. Viking trade towns, places like Hiddeby, Burka, Koppen, were busy in a practical way, not constant festival busy. More like persistent weekday busy, people arriving, people leaving, goods piling up, goods being repacked, boats being repaired, fish being dried, timber being measured. And somewhere in that steady activity, silver appears like punctuation. A payment here, a fine there, a bride price somewhere else. A gift that is also a transaction wearing a friendly face. The same silver might pass through many hands in a short time, and each time it is weighed again, as if the world needs repeated reassurance that reality is still consistent. There is an almost soothing rhythm to it. Open pouch, pour fragments, set weights, adjust, wait for balance, nod, close pouch. It's the kind of repetitive motion that can lull you if you let it. Like folding laundry, but with more mild distrust. Because distrust is part of trade too, and in a system based on metal by weight, people become very interested in whether the metal is truly what it claims to be. Silver can be mixed. Silver can be plated. Silver can be lied about. So the Viking world also used testing tools, including touchstones, small stones on which you rub metal to leave a streak, comparing the color to known standards. It's like a quiet little chemistry lab at the edge of a market stall. No sparks, no drama. Just a person rubbing metal on stone and deciding whether to trust it. If you've ever watched someone check a bill with a pen and thought, this is awkward but necessary, you understand the vibe. And then there are the hacks, not the computer kind, the literal kind. A knife comes out and a piece is cut off, and suddenly money is smaller. That cutting could happen casually, without any feeling of sacrilege, because value was not tied to a perfect circle. It was tied to grams, to weight, to the calm finality of a scale settling. Sometimes you find hoards where the silver is already chopped up, which is a detail that feels both practical and slightly sad. Not because the owner meant it sadly, but because a hoard is a pause life. Someone gathered these bits, kept them safe, hid them, and then didn't come back. Hoards are like unfinished sentences buried in the ground, and the earth, being patient, keeps them for centuries without commenting. If you want a micro hook that stays gentle, consider the simple question: why bury money at all? Partly because there were no banks in the modern sense, and partly because the ground is a quiet kind of security. You can be robbed by a stranger if your wealth is hidden under a stone you can recognize in the dark. Unless, of course, you forget exactly which stone you used, which is a very human problem that has probably happened more often than anyone likes to admit. The Viking Age gives us many hoards, and each hoard suggests both prosperity and anxiety. Prosperity because there was enough silver to save, anxiety because saving meant hiding. The most boring treasure in the world is still treasure if you're worried about tomorrow. This is also where the story turns softly toward law, because law is the invisible scaffolding behind a lot of trade. In Viking societies, disputes could be handled through assemblies, things where arguments were aired, witnesses mattered, and outcomes could be negotiated with words and compensation rather than constant violence. We like to imagine the past as a place where everything is solved with an axe, but even people who own axes often prefer paperwork, or at least public agreement. Viking law codes and sagas preserve the idea of wargold, compensation payments for injury or death, turning harm into a grim kind of arithmetic. It is not comforting, exactly, but it is revealing. Silver was not just for buying cloth. Silver was also for repairing social fabric after it tore. A coin fragment could be part of a settlement that allowed two families to stop escalating. In that sense, hack silver is not only commerce, it is social pressure made measurable. And because we're keeping this bedtime soft, we can notice the dry irony without making it sharp. A society can be very proud of honor and still rely on a scale to smooth over conflict. The scale becomes a mediator, not a moral mediator, but a practical one. This much silver becomes a sentence that ends an argument, at least publicly. Privately, people might still simmer, but public simmering is exhausting and everyone has chores to do. There is something almost modern about that. People want closure, even if it's imperfect, because they need to get back to repairing boats and feeding animals and trying not to freeze. Now imagine a market day again, but focus on the small sensory things that don't look heroic in a painting. The smell of damp wool, the sound of wood creaking under feet, the feel of a leather pouch warmed by a poem, the soft clink of metal fragments that are slightly different sizes, like a tiny wind chime that only plays for the person holding it. The seller watches the scale. The buyer watches the seller's eyes. Someone nearby sells fish, and the fish smell does not care about your economic system. A child wanders too close, is gently pulled back, because markets are full of sharp edges and impatient adults. Somewhere someone is chewing because people always chew, even in history. The scene is ordinary, which is the point. Most of the past was ordinary, even when it contained extraordinary things. If you'd like another unnecessary detail, consider that silver hoards sometimes include not only coins and ingots, but chopped jewelry, as if someone faced a choice between beauty and flexibility and chose flexibility. That doesn't mean they didn't value beauty. It means they valued survival more. An arm ring could be worn as status and then cut as payment. A necklace could be admired and then reduced into fragments when necessary. Wealth could be both display and emergency resource, which makes it feel less like fantasy treasure and more like a modern savings account. Except the savings account is wearable and occasionally bites your wrist in winter. And now, quietly, we drift into the aftertaste, the part where the record meets the imagination. How do we know these things? We know them because of small, stubborn objects that refuse to disappear. Silver lasts. Weights last. Scales leave traces. Hoards are found under floors and fields near old paths, tucked into corners of human decision. Archaeologists find chopped arms and hacked up rings, and little sets of weights that look like they belong in a dollhouse. Written sources, sagas, law texts, chronicles give us language and framing, but the objects give us the texture of daily practice. The objects say, someone did this often enough that it became routine, and routine is always the quiet engine behind history. There's also a gentle caution here, like a bedtime reminder that we don't know everything. A hoard doesn't tell us the owner's name. A weight doesn't tell us the face of the person who used it. A chopped coin doesn't preserve the conversation that happened when it changed hands. So we read shadows. We read patterns. We read what people left behind because they couldn't carry it into the future. And we accept that the past is partly silent, not because it was empty, but because not everyone's life gets archived with care. The Viking Age is famous, but most Vikings were not. Most people were just people trying to get through seasons, trying to make trade work, trying to keep enough silver in the pouch that tomorrow felt possible. If you want a soft modern analogy that doesn't disrupt the sleepy mood, think of hack silver like paying in cash and getting change, except the change is made by cutting your own money into smaller pieces. It's inconvenient in a way that feels strangely intimate. Modern money is designed to be handled quickly. Viking silver required more handling, more judgment, more tiny decisions. And yet it worked because humans are remarkably good at building systems out of repeated gestures. Open pouch, pour pieces, balance scale, nod, close pouch. Walk away. The system doesn't need to be perfect. It just needs to be shared enough that most people agree to keep using it. So here is a quiet bedtime oath for a very small, very practical kind of history. Keep the facts in one jar. Hack silver, folding scales, tiny weights, touchstones, hoards in the ground. Keep the myth in another jar. Bold raids, shining treasure, clean hero stories. If the myth gets too loud, tap the jar of facts gently and listen for the soft clink of chopped metal. That sound is not exciting, but it is honest. Tomorrow, if you ever catch yourself thinking of the Viking world as only shouting and sails, remember one tiny thing. Somewhere someone was squinting at a scale, trying to decide whether a piece of silver was worth what the other person claimed. That is the kind of moment that doesn't make it into epic poetry, and yet it is the moment that makes the world move. And now we can let everything soften again. Imagine the pouch closing. Imagine the weights settling back into their little leather pocket like sleepy seeds. Imagine a market quieting as the day cools, the way noise drains out of a place when people go home. The river keeps moving because rivers never stop working. A boat creaks softly against a dock. A person counts their silver by feel rather than by sight because habit is faster than light. Somewhere, a hoard waits under earth that doesn't know it's guarding wealth, only knows it is holding something dense and quiet. The air grows heavier, calmer. The scale, folded shut, becomes just another object resting in darkness. If you're still awake, you don't need to force yourself toward an ending. There isn't one neat ending anyway. Silver keeps traveling. It keeps being cut, it keeps being weighed. The past keeps repeating its small gestures through different hands. And your own mind can follow the same gentle loop, a detail, an explanation, a small dry smile at how practical humans are, and then a slow drift back into quiet. The clink of silver fades, the pouch stays closed, the river keeps its steady pace, and the story, like a careful scale settling into balance, stops asking you to hold it tightly and simply rests there with you, light enough now to let your thoughts loosen and loose enough to let sleep arrive without needing to announce itself. You might not expect a river to behave like a receipt, but in the Viking world it often did. A river could quietly list what moved, where it stopped, and who ended up holding what at the end, even if the river never learned anyone's name. It just carried. It carried timber and grain, and sometimes it carried people, tucked into the same idea of cargo that a boat understands without asking questions. Picture black water again, oars dipping with that sleepy practice rhythm that doesn't splash unless it has to. Picture a chain ring answering softly as if it too is tired. And somewhere ahead, a market bell sounds once and stops, like it remembered this is a bedtime hour. Where and what time are you listening from? If you zoom in on Viking rating and trade long enough, you start noticing that the truly powerful thing isn't always the sword. It's the root. Roots are the quiet engine behind everything. A root is repetition made profitable. You do the same movement again and again until it stops feeling like an event and starts feeling like a habit. Rivers were perfect for this because rivers are naturally committed to going somewhere. A river doesn't get distracted. A river doesn't decide it's too late and turn around. It just keeps going, which is an unsettlingly efficient personality trait. And if you have a boat, a river becomes a highway that doesn't need paving. In a world where roads can be muddy, slow, and full of awkward conversations, water is a shortcut with fewer witnesses. A boat can outrun a rumor. A boat can arrive before anyone has finished deciding what they think about the last arrival. The movement along these waterways was not always dramatic. Often it was practical, boring, and very planned, which is part of what makes it hard history. There are stops for food, stops for repairs, stops because the weather told everyone to wait. There are pauses where negotiations happen in low voices, not because anyone is whispering, but because people tend to speak quietly when they're discussing valuable things in public. And sometimes the valuable thing is a barrel of fish. Sometimes it's a bundle of furs. And sometimes it has a human life being treated as if it belongs on the list next to the fish and the furs. The most unsettling systems are often the ones that don't need constant shouting. If you still awake by the time I get to the part where a boat stops for routine maintenance, feel free to subscribe. But honestly, don't strain yourself. Viking logistics already had enough strain in it without you adding more. When captives were moved, rivers offered a kind of quiet speed. You can imagine inland places where a raid or a local conflict produces captives, and then the captives are taken toward larger waterways, the way goods are taken toward larger markets. That's the part that feels cold, and it should feel cold, even in a calm voice. But we can talk about it without making it theatrical. The point isn't to shock you awake. The point is to notice how human movement can be folded into business movement until both are described with the same practical language. And the language matters. Once you call someone cargo, you can start thinking about them in terms of space and weight and resale value, which is exactly how cruel systems protect themselves. They make cruelty sound like bookkeeping. There's a small, oddly specific detail here that can keep your mind lightly curious. Boats have limits. They have weight capacity. They have space. They have the need to keep balance because a boat that tips is a boat that becomes an emergency. So the people running these routes had to think like planners. Who goes where? Who sits where? How to keep control with the least effort. How to make the trip efficient. It's the kind of thinking we associate with shipping companies and warehouse managers, which is an uncomfortable comparison, but it's also true in a simple way. If you turn people into product, You start optimizing the process the way you optimize any process. And optimization is, in its own boring way, one of the most dangerous human talents. As the river becomes wider and the route approaches the sea, the world becomes less private. Inland movement can hide behind trees and distance. Port towns, on the other hand, are noisy with daylight. Port towns have witnesses by accident, because that's what happens when many people gather to trade. They have guards who are there to protect commerce, which is not the same thing as protecting people. They have scribes, sometimes in scales, and official-looking figures who make transactions feel legitimate simply by standing nearby. There's a particular kind of calm that comes from routine public trade. Even when the goods are grim, the structure of the marketplace tries to make everything feel like normal business. In a port town, you can buy grain and rope and salted fish, and then, in the same economic atmosphere, you can witness a human life being priced. That contrast is part of the historical aftertaste that lingers. And then there's the ledger, the quiet paper shadow that follows all of this. The ledger is where the human face disappears fastest, because a ledger doesn't care about faces. It cares about categories, it cares about numbers. A ledger is an object designed to reduce reality into manageable lines. That's its job. It can list a payment, a debt, a fine, a sale. It can list 1 and 2 and 3 in neat marks. The human mind likes neat marks because neat marks make the world feel controllable. And if you've ever made a shopping list to calm yourself down, you understand the innocent version of that feeling. The ledger is the same impulse, scaled up, hardened, and sometimes used to record things that should never have been for sale. Let the scene drift gently into what a market day might look like, because market is not always one clean square with a clear sign. Markets are often a collection of places where trade happens because trade is allowed to happen there. Sometimes it's a dock where boats unload. Sometimes it's a courtyard where people gather. Sometimes it's a house with a locked back room, which is the kind of detail that feels almost modern in its discomfort, like you can picture the door. The quiet click the way voices change when they move behind it. And prices, of course, shift. They shift with age, with health, with perceived skill, with the buyer's purpose. A buyer might be looking for farm work. A buyer might want household labor. A buyer might be buying status in the grim way humans sometimes buy status by demonstrating control over another person. The market becomes a place where everything is compared, weighed, judged, and turned into a number. Language matters intensely here, and that's another small hook worth holding lightly. If the person being sold doesn't speak the local language, then an interpreter becomes part of the machinery. Names may be changed because names are personal and commerce prefers impersonal. A person can be renamed the way a product line is renamed to fit the new owner's world. That act renaming sounds simple, but it's one of the quiet violences that doesn't require a weapon. It requires only permission, and markets are built on permission. Permission to sell, permission to buy, permission to treat a human being as transferable property. The most chilling detail isn't always overt cruelty. It's the ordinariness, bargaining voices, the sound of coins, the small hum of people trying to get a good deal, as if they were purchasing wool. If your mind is starting to drift, you can let it drift while still catching little absurdities at the edges, because history is full of them. For example, many Viking transactions relied on weights and measures that had to be trusted, which means that even in grim contexts, people worried about fraud. Imagine someone being very serious about whether a silver piece is properly weighed, while ignoring the moral catastrophe of the transaction it's funding. Humans are remarkably good at being precise about the wrong things. We can be meticulous about coins and careless about lives. It's a dry, gentle irony, and you don't need to laugh at it to notice it. You can simply see it, like noticing dust in a beam of light. Markets also have sensory textures that are stubbornly ordinary. The smell of damp wood by the dock, the tang of salt, the animal warmth of crowded bodies, the creak of rope, the soft bud of a sack set down, the scrape of a scale on a table. Someone chewing on something, because someone is always chewing on something in history. A child is pulled back by a sleeve because adults are busy and the ground is uneven and the world is not designed for children to feel safe at markets. The mundane details are what make the scene feel real, and the reality is what makes it hard to romanticize. This is not a story with a heroic arc. It's a system. It's a pattern. And patterns are often the most powerful thing humans create. Now, because this is boring history for sleep, we're allowed to linger on the bureaucracy without racing toward any dramatic climax. Bureaucracy is, in a way, the ultimate sleepy topic. It is slow. It is repetitive. It is full of terms that sound like they were invented to make your eyes close. But it's also where systems show their shape. Laws in Norse societies and surrounding regions could define categories of people, rights, obligations, and punishments. If you read legal texts, you find that they can name slavery without flinching. They can describe ownership as if it's a normal part of the social world. That's not because the law is evil in a cartoon way. It's because law tends to record what a society permits, not what it should permit. And once something is written into law, it becomes easier to treat it as how things are, which is another quiet mechanism of normalization. Sometimes transactions happened in daylight with enough formality to feel almost mundane. Scribes, witnesses, guards, a public space where everyone pretends this is simply trade. That publicness can be both revealing and obscuring. Revealing because it shows the practice wasn't always hidden. Obscuring because public routine makes people less likely to question what's happening. If everyone else looks calm, you feel pressure to look calm too. If everyone else calls it normal, you start calling it normal. Humans are social creatures, and social pressure is one of our most efficient tools. It works in classrooms and office meetings, and it also worked in port towns 1,000 years ago, under different skies. And that brings us, softly, to a place where we can end without ending, because this topic doesn't resolve neatly. A river route doesn't resolve. A market day doesn't resolve. It simply stops when the light changes and starts again when conditions allow. The water keeps moving. The boats keep traveling. The ledger keeps receiving lines of ink. And the people who were treated as cargo are the part we most want to hear from, but the part history preserves least. That absence is its own evidence. It tells you where the record tends to point its flashlight and where it leaves darkness. So here's a gentle bedtime hold for this section of the story, not a conclusion, just a way to set it down carefully. Remember that the same tide that carried grain and timber also carried lives, quietly bundled into trade. Remember that markets can happen on docks and courtyards and houses with locked rooms, because commerce adapts to space the way water adapts to land. Remember that language interpreters, renaming, categories can be as powerful as chains, because language decides what a person is allowed to be in the eyes of the system. And if that feels heavy, you don't need to carry it with clenched hands. You can hold it the way you hold a difficult fact at bedtime, gently, clearly, without forcing yourself to solve it tonight. Let the scene soften now. The market bell is quiet. The dock is quieter. Coins settle into pouches like stones settling into the bottom of a river. The river keeps doing what rivers do, moving without commentary, carrying reflections of sky and the slow creak of boats. The ledger closes not because the story is finished, but because it's night and even history needs to pause between lines. And you can pause too, letting the water sounds fade in your mind, letting the details blur into a calm, distant hum, until your thoughts feel less like a crowded marketplace and more like a river at midnight steady unhurried carrying you towards sleep without asking for applause. You might assume a slave market would look like a single, obvious place with a clear sign and a neat square, and everyone standing in orderly rows like they were waiting for bread. But in the Viking world, and in many medieval worlds, it could be much more ordinary than that, and that ordinariness is part of what makes it hard to hold in the mind. Sometimes the market was simply wherever buying and selling was allowed to happen without too much trouble. A dock at the edge of water, a courtyard between buildings where footsteps echo, a narrow lane beside a warehouse that smells of tar and damp rope. Sometimes it was a house, and sometimes it was the locked room at the back of the house, the kind of room that turns a home into a business without changing the roof. And before we drift any deeper into this quiet, uncomfortable geography, a small question you can answer only to yourself. Where and what time are you listening from? If you've ever walked through a modern city and noticed how many important things happen behind doors you never open, you already understand the basic shape of it. Markets are not only public squares, markets are networks of permission. They are habits, they are routines, and routines can make almost anything feel normal to the people inside them, even when what they're doing should never have been normal at all. Port towns were built for movement. People arrive, people leave, goods pile up. Goods are repacked. A boat's cargo becomes a day's work for a dozen hands, and the hands don't necessarily ask too many questions about the cargo. Not because the hands are made of stone, but because hands belong to bodies, and bodies belong to lives, and lives are often focused on food, rent, weather, and getting through the next week. It's a soft, bitter truth. Systems don't need everyone to be enthusiastic. They only need enough people to keep doing their jobs. If you're still awake by the time we get to the part where someone argues about the price of a human life, the way they de-argue about a sack of grain, you can subscribe if you want. Or don't. I'm not going to ring a bell about it. The bell in this story has already done enough. In a port town, the market day feel can spread across the whole place. It's not always contained. There are transactions near the water because boats unload there. There are transactions near storehouses because goods are stored there. There are transactions near taverns because people who trade also drink, and people who drink also decide things they'll regret in the morning. There are transactions near the homes of wealthy merchants because wealth has a habit of pulling commerce toward it the way a fire pulls hands toward warmth. And then there are the smaller, less visible places, back rooms, side courtyards, fenced yards where the business can happen with fewer eyes. Not no eyes, fewer, because fewer eyes means fewer complications. And medieval commerce, like modern commerce, likes fewer complications. A slave market, in the strict sense, doesn't need special architecture. It only needs 3 things: a place, a buyer, and the permission to treat a person as an object. Once those exist, the rest can be improvised. A dock is convenient because it is already a place where people and goods arrive. A courtyard is convenient because it is already a place where people gather. A house is convenient because it already has doors, and doors can be locked, and a locked door is a way of saying, this is private, even when what's inside is not private in any moral sense. If you want a small, strangely specific detail, imagine the sound of that lock. It doesn't sound like evil. It sounds like metal. It sounds like a routine click. And routine clicks are often the soundtrack of the worst parts of history. When a sale happens, the process can look disturbingly familiar if you strip away the moral horror and focus only on the mechanics. People examine what they're about to buy. They ask questions, they negotiate, they try to get a better deal. They try to reduce uncertainty because uncertainty is expensive. Buyers might look at a person's hands the way they'd look at a tool, checking for signs of work. They might watch posture, movement, responsiveness, because the buyer's imagination is already turning the person into a future labor plan. They might ask about origin, language, and age, because these details affect value in the grim arithmetic of the market. They might ask questions that sound like they belong to a job interview, except the job is not being offered. It is being imposed. And it's worth saying softly, the market doesn't need whips cracking every minute to be cruel. It can be cruel with calm voices and careful prices. Prices shifted, always. They shifted with health because illness is inconvenient to buyers. They shifted with age because youth suggests longer usefulness and age suggests experience, but also wear. They shifted with skills because a person who can do something specific craft work, language interpreting, household management can be priced differently than a person whose labor is imagined only as strength. They shifted with the buyer's purpose. Some buyers wanted farm labor, some wanted household labor, some wanted prestige, which is one of the bleakest reasons to buy another human, not because you need the work, but because you want the display of control. Markets can turn vanity into an economic force. History is full of that, and it's rarely shouted about. It's usually just done. There's also the quiet matter of language, which is not a side issue here. Language is central, because language decides how easily a person can be commanded, and it also decides how easily a person can be understood. A market where sellers and buyers speak one language and captives speak another becomes a place where translators, interpreters gain strange power. The interpreter can shape the story. The interpreter can smooth the transaction. The interpreter can reduce a person's speech into something sellable. Even when no one intends extra cruelty, translation itself can become a kind of reduction. Human experience becomes a summary. A summary becomes a category. A category becomes a price. If you've ever watched someone get reduced to a profile on a form, height, age, skills, you can feel a pale shadow of the same process. The difference, of course, is that in this market, the form is not for matching opportunities. It's for transferring ownership. Names matter too, and not in the romantic way names matter in sagas. In markets, names can be treated as optional. People can be renamed because a new owner wants a name that fits their world, or because the seller wants to make the product sound more familiar, or because it's easier to remember a label than a person. Renaming is a quiet violence because it rearranges identity without needing any physical force. It's a way of saying, you are what I call you now, and it can happen with the same casualness as renaming a ship. And ships, ironically, were sometimes given names with more care than the people carried inside them. That's not a joke. It's just the shape of the cruelty. Now, if your mind is trying to protect itself by drifting, let it drift, but keep one small hook lightly in your hand. How ordinary the market could feel. That detail returns again and again in historical work on slavery and forced labor. The horror isn't only in exceptional moments of violence. It's in the way buying and selling can blend into daily commerce. A person bargains. A person counts coins. Someone complains about the weather. Someone talks about the quality of wool. Someone mentions a repair that needs doing on their roof. And in the middle of these ordinary concerns, a human being is transferred as property. The coins clink. The transaction ends. People move on. The world does not pause. And that lack of pause is part of what makes systems last. Port towns were loud in daylight, but not always loud in the way you imagine. They were busy. Busy has its own sound. Carts rolling, footsteps, doors opening, sacks being dropped, voices calling prices, gulls screaming as if they're paid per scream. The slave trade could exist inside that sound like a dark thread woven into cloth. It didn't need a separate soundtrack. It could borrow the soundtrack of normal life, and that is why it can feel chilling without being dramatic. You can imagine a dock where fish is being unloaded. Fish always smells like fish, no matter what moral decisions are happening nearby, and next to that, a transaction that turns a wife into inventory. The fish smell does not change. The tide does not change. The rope does not become morally offended. The world stays physically ordinary while human behavior becomes extraordinary in its wrongness. Sometimes the market wasn't even particularly centralized. In some towns, it might be dispersed smaller transactions happening in multiple places. A dock sale, a courtyard negotiation, a private agreement made at a merchant's table, a delivery to a household that is framed as a purchase like any other. That dispersal makes it harder for modern minds to picture because we like neat locations. We like the idea that evil lives in one building you can avoid. But history, unfortunately, doesn't always give you one building. It gives you a network. It gives you scattered rooms. It gives you familiar streets. It gives you the uncomfortable truth that a town can have a church and a market and a family dinner and a system of human sale operating all at once. Because human societies are capable of holding contradictions without collapsing from the weight of them. If you need a micro hook that is almost absurd in its pointlessness, consider the role of scales in these markets. Not just scales for silver, but the general habit of measuring everything. Medieval trade is obsessed with weight, measure, and proof. Buyers want reassurance. Sellers want profit. Both sides want a process that feels legitimate. So you find scales, weights, tally marks, witness statements, and the occasional official presence that makes the whole thing feel regulated. There is a dry irony here that you can notice without laughing. Regulation can make terrible things feel respectable. A guard standing nearby doesn't mean something is just. It can simply mean it is permitted. A scribe writing a line doesn't make the line moral. It makes it durable. The ink lasts longer than the moment, and sometimes that is exactly the problem. Now, it's important to keep our tone gentle and avoid turning this into a vivid horror scene, because you're trying to sleep, not sit upright and alarm. So we stay with the textures that are quiet, the way buyers speak in practical phrases, the way sellers use calm words. For grim realities, the way someone might say strong or useful with the same voice they do use for a horse. Horses in Viking life were valuable, boats were valuable, tools were valuable, and in the slave system, people are forced into that same category of valuable property, which is the whole shape of the wrongness. You don't need blood and shouting to understand it. You only need the language of property applied to a human being. Imagine for a moment the buyer's mindset, not to sympathize, but to understand the machinery. The buyer is thinking about work that needs doing. The buyer is thinking about household status. The buyer is thinking about whether the purchase will be noticed by neighbors. The buyer is thinking about whether the person will run, whether they will resist, whether they will fit into the household's routines. Routines again. Routines are everything. Even oppression runs on routines. A household can absorb a new person into its schedule the way it absorbs a new animal into the stable. Feed times, work times, sleep spaces, rules. The buyer imagines all of that, and the imagining becomes part of the purchase. The human being becomes a future schedule. That's the quiet cruelty, turning a life into a plan. The seller, on the other hand, is thinking about profit, risk, and speed. Holding captives is risky. Feeding them costs money. Guarding them costs energy. Transporting them costs time. The seller wants a quick sale. The seller wants coin or silver or goods that can be converted into coin or silver. The seller wants to reduce uncertainty. This is where the market becomes a place of calculation, and calculation is, in its own sleepy way, extremely boring, which is why it can hide in plain sight. A transaction can be a long conversation about numbers and conditions. It can be a debate over payment form. It can be a negotiation about timing. And in the middle of that, the human reality is treated as secondary because the market's logic is built to push humanity to the edges. Sometimes people were sold far from where they were taken. That distance adds another layer of disorientation that we can acknowledge without dwelling on pain in detail. Distance breaks familiarity. Distance makes language harder. Distance makes rescue unlikely. Distance makes a person more manageable in the eyes of the system, which is another grim reason roots mattered so much. Rivers and seas didn't only carry goods, they carried disconnection. The further you are from home, the more your identity can be rewritten by someone else. An identity rewriting through renaming, through re-rules, through new language becomes part of how a market turns a person into a thing. If you want one more micro hook that feels oddly specific and gently ironic, notice how the market can contain both casualness and fear at the same time. A buyer can be casual because the system supports them. A seller can be casual because the business is routine. A bystander can be casual because looking too closely feels like stepping into trouble. And under that casualness, there's often a quiet fear, but not always the fear you expect. Fear of conflict, fear of getting cheated, fear of being seen, fear of law, depending on the place, fear of divine judgment sometimes, though people are very skilled at compartmentalizing divine judgment until it becomes inconvenient. Humans have always been capable of praying in one room and buying suffering in another, and then acting surprised when the rooms feel connected. Now let the scene drift toward the edge of the market day, when the light changes and people start thinking about food and sleep. Markets wind down, voices get hoarser. The dock smells stronger as the air cools. Coins disappear into purses. Silver fragments return to pouches, doors close. And the locked back rooms become just rooms again, except they aren't really just rooms, because what happened inside them lingers in the structure of the town, in the economy, in the legal categories, in the quiet assumptions people carry like invisible tools. This is the aftertaste of systems. They don't vanish when the market closes. They remain in how households run, in who is considered fully human by law, and who is allowed to own, and who is allowed to speak without punishment. If you're letting yourself drift, you can drift on one steady idea. The market's ordinariness is not an excuse. It's evidence of how deeply a society can normalize something terrible. And we know what we know because traces remain. Not enough traces, never enough. But there are hints, chains and locks and weights and traded silver and legal texts that name categories and sagas that speak around the truth without always staring at it. There are foreign accounts that notice captives far from home. There are patterns in archaeology that suggest movement and commerce and the human cost hidden inside it. The evidence is often structural rather than personal. We can see the shape of the system more easily than we can hear the individual voices caught inside it. So, as we set this section down gently, keep one detail in your hand like a small stone. A slave market didn't always look like a dramatic arena. Sometimes it looked like a dock. Sometimes it looked like a courtyard. Sometimes it looked like a locked back room in an ordinary house. And the most chilling sound wasn't necessarily screaming. It could be bargaining. It could be coins. It could be the calm voice of someone saying a price. The bell might ring once, then stop. The day might move on. The tide might keep carrying boats as if it has no opinion. And night comes anyway, softening the edges of the town, quieting the dock, letting the coins sleep in their purses, letting doors rest in their frames. You don't need to force your mind to finish this. History rarely finishes neatly. It continues into the next routine, the next household, the next legal clause, the next market day. For now, let the river sound return in your imagination, not as a dramatic escape, but as a steady background that doesn't demand anything from you. The oars hush. The chain answers softly. The bell stays quiet. The town settles into darkness the way a book settles closed on a table. And your thoughts, if they want to, can settle too, loosening their grip on the details until the details become a distant hum, still real, still true, but far enough away now to let sleep arrive without needing to argue its way in. You might think the most dramatic part of a slave system would be the moment of capture or the moment of sale, because those are the moments that sound like events. But the truly powerful part is often what happens afterward, when everything becomes routine. The quiet question isn't only what happened, but what did a Tuesday look like? And that is a strangely sleepy question because Tuesday tends to have a way of draining drama out of almost anything. Even mythic people get tired on Tuesday. Even the sea gets tired. Even a household, once the door closes, mostly wants to run like a household. And if you're listening somewhere soft and dim right now, you can let that thought settle. Where and what time are you listening from? In Norse societies, enslaved people were often called thralls, and the word itself has the heavy, blunt sound of a tool being set down on a table. Thralls were not a rare, hidden phenomenon in the Viking Age. They were woven into farms, boats, and homes, not because the world was uniquely monstrous in Scandinavia, but because the medieval world in general had many ways of turning humans into labor and status. If you want an oddly specific detail to hold gently, it's this. A household is a system. A household needs water carried, fires tended, animals fed, grain ground, clothes washed, floors swept, tools repaired, and food stored in ways that don't invite mice to throw a celebration. A household also needs people to do those things, and if the household is wealthy enough, it may prefer that some of those people have no choice. That preference can become tradition. Tradition can become law, and law can become the kind of quiet, background hum that makes injustice feel like furniture. If you're still awake by the time we get to the part where someone's social status is basically written into where they're allowed to sleep, feel free to subscribe. Or don't. Honestly, medieval household hierarchies can be exhausting, and I don't want to add more obligations to your night. A thrall in a household did labor that kept everything running, which means their work could be both very visible and strangely invisible at the same time. Visible because you can't cook without someone moving pots and chopping food and bringing in water. Invisible because once a task is done well, it disappears into normality. The fire is simply burning. The floor is simply clean. The bread is simply on the table. If you've ever lived with someone who quietly does half the chores, you know how easily a person's effort becomes the way the house is. Now imagine that same disappearing of effort, but backed by coercion instead of mutual agreement. That's the kind of quiet wrongness that can last a long time without needing constant violence. It runs on routine. It runs on the fact that humans adapt to whatever becomes daily. The tasks thralls did weren't always the same, because households weren't all the same. On farms, thralls might be out with animals, mending fences, cutting hay, digging, hauling, and doing the seasonal work that never ends so much as it rotates. The Viking Age countryside is not a place of leisurely silence. It's a place where winter is always coming back, even when it has politely stepped away for a few months. That means storing food, preserving fish, salting meat, drying grain, and keeping tools from turning into useless lumps of rust. A thrall could be involved in every step of that, because survival requires a lot of small, boring actions done consistently. And boring actions, ironically, are exactly the actions that build wealth. A saga might praise a warrior, but a farm runs on someone remembering to repair a roof before the rain arrives. The roof does not care about glory dot inside the household. Labor could be more intimate, and intimacy under coercion is one of the hardest things to think about without turning it into either melodrama or numbness. So we stay calm and simple. Household labor means cleaning, cooking, carrying, watching children, grinding grain into flour, and doing the repetitive jobs that make a home feel like it's holding together rather than sliding into chaos. Grinding grain is an especially sleepy detail because it's so repetitive you can almost hear it as a rhythm in the background of history, the slow turn of a hand mill, the grain becoming meal, the meal becoming bread, the bread becoming normal. A household might not speak about the person turning the millstone, because the household is busy enjoying the result. That is how exploitation hides. It hides under bread. There is also the social geometry of the house, which is a small, specific thing that can keep your mind lightly curious. Where you sleep, where you sit, and where you are allowed to stand, these can be forms of status as much as any official title. In a longhouse, space is shared, but it is not shared equally. Proximity to the central fire can mean warmth and importance. The best sleeping spots are not random. They are claimed by those with authority. Thralls might sleep in less desirable places, closer to drafts, closer to doors, closer to the edges where the night air sneaks in. And that physical placement becomes a daily reminder of hierarchy, which means hierarchy doesn't need to be announced. It simply exists in the layout of bodies and blankets. Food works the same way. Not only what you eat, but when you eat, and with whom. Even today, who sits at the table and who stands in the kitchen tells you something about a household structure. In the Viking Age, meals were a social ritual, and rituals tend to reinforce power. Thralls might eat after others, or eat different food, or eat in different places, depending on the household. It might not always be dramatic. It might simply be a habit, a bowl set down later, a smaller portion, a piece of fish that's more bone than meat. And again, the horror is not in constant shouting. It's in the way inequality can become as quiet as a spoon scraping wood. One of the strange details about enslaved labor is that it can require both control and trust, which sounds like a contradiction, and it is. A household needs work done well. Work done well requires skill, attention, and sometimes initiative. Even under coercion, people still have hands and minds and memories. A thrall might learn the rhythms of a farm, the quirks of animals, the timing of bread, the best way to keep smoke from filling the room, the best way to store food so it lasts. That knowledge makes a person valuable, and in grim systems, valuable often means more tightly controlled, not more respected. But it can also mean the household relies on them in ways the household doesn't openly admit. Reliance can create strange social tension because the household wants the benefits of competence without granting the person the dignity of full membership. If you want a microhook that feels oddly technical, consider that medieval societies had legal categories and customs that recognized slavery, but also tried to manage it like any other property relationship. That means you can find references in law codes and records that treat enslaved people as assets with rules around them. Some legal texts talk about compensation if a thrall is harmed by someone else, not because the thrall's suffering matters to the system, but because the owner's loss matters. It's the same grim logic as compensation for a damaged tool. And that's a dry irony you can notice softly. The law can recognize harm without recognizing humanity. And it can do it in a tone as calm as bookkeeping. There's also the matter of names and identity inside households. A thrall's original name might be known, or it might be ignored, or it might be replaced. Renaming can happen for convenience, for dominance, or simply because the new household wants names that fit their language. That doesn't require drama. It can happen in the same casual tone as naming a new calf. And if that comparison makes you uncomfortable, it should. It's one of the quiet clues to how the system worked. People were fitted into household order the way animals and tools were fitted into household order. And household order is, at its core, about predictability. Predictability makes life easier for those in control. Sometimes thralls were used for public, heavy tasks, and sometimes for private, constant tasks. Heavy tasks are visible hauling timber, digging, rowing, carrying stones. Private tasks are less visible cleaning, cooking, minding children, maintaining clothing, preparing supplies. The invisible tasks are often the ones that keep a household feeling stable. And stability is the kind of luxury people don't notice until it's gone. So the household may become dependent on the thrall's labor in a way that feels natural to them because it's been normalized through repetition. One day becomes a week becomes a year becomes how things are. And then there's the social atmosphere, the way people talk or don't talk about status. In many societies with slavery, the presence of enslaved labor reshapes what freedom means for everyone else. Free people define themselves partly by not being enslaved. That means a thrall's existence can become a constant negative reference point. At least I'm not that. It's a quiet psychological mechanism, and it can make communities more willing to accept inequality because inequality becomes part of identity. If you want a modern analogy that stays soft, think of how people sometimes soothe themselves by comparing their problems to someone who has it worse, instead of asking why anyone has to have it worse at all. It's not a perfect comparison, that it shows the shape of the mental shortcut. Mental shortcuts are comforting. They are also dangerous. In Norse contexts, thralls appear in sagas and later writings in ways that can be casual, which again tells you about normalization. The texts sometimes treat thralls as background figures, part of the scene, like furniture that moves. That doesn't mean thralls were literally invisible. It means the storytellers often didn't center them, and we, reading later, can feel the absence. The absence is one of the most consistent features of slavery in the historical record. The people most affected are the people least recorded in their own voice. You can sense them in the structure: who does labor, who is bought, who is sold, who is freed, who is renamed, but you rarely hear the private interior of their experience. History gives us outlines. It gives us shadows. It gives us the shape of a system more than the sound of a person inside it. Still, within that system, lives were lived. Not in an inspiring, romantic way, just in the ordinary way humans live, even under constraint. People learn routines. People form small relationships. People find tiny spaces of agency where they can, sometimes in ways that are hard for outsiders to notice. Maybe it's doing a task in a way that saves a little energy. Maybe it's remembering a song in a language no one else in the household knows. Maybe it's watching the seasons change and finding some comfort in predictability, because predictability can be a form of safety even when the system is unsafe. None of that redeems the system. It just reminds you that human life persists even in bad conditions, which is both tragic and stubbornly ordinary. The household also uses thralls to display wealth. This is one of the least dramatic but most revealing parts. If you can command many hands, you can do more work, produce more surplus, and host more impressive gatherings. In a society where feasting and gift-giving mattered, having extra labor could support status. That means thralls were not only labor, they were also symbols. Symbols are quieter than weapons, but they travel further. A wealthy household might quietly signal, through the smooth running of everything, that they have more hands than they technically need. The house looks calm, the food appears on time, the floors are swept, the clothing is maintained, the animals are fed. The host can sit and talk because someone else is doing the endless list of small tasks. Calm is often purchased. Sometimes it's purchased with silver. Sometimes it's purchased with someone's freedom. If you want another microhook, notice the tension between public and private in household slavery. On one hand, it's deeply private. It happens in homes, in daily routines, in quiet rules. On the other hand, it's public because everyone knows who is free and who is not. Everyone can see who belongs to whom, at least in broad social terms. That public knowledge can create a kind of social policing. People behave according to expectations because the community enforces expectations. And enforcement doesn't always look like violence. It can look like gossip. It can look like shame. It can look like someone reminding you with a calm voice, you know your place. Calm voices can be weapons too. Sometimes thralls could be moved between households, given as gifts, traded, inherited. That's another way of a system's cruelty becomes boring. It turns people into transferable items inside family economics. Inheritance is usually framed as a quiet, sleepy topic. Who gets what when someone dies? In a slave system, inheritance can include people. The idea is so heavy that the mind wants to recoil. But if you're listening for sleep, you don't have to recoil sharply. You can acknowledge it the way you acknowledge a cold night. Yes, that is cold and is real. It also shows you how deeply embedded the system was, because it wasn't only about markets. It was about households as units of property and continuity. The term thrall itself lingers in language like a fossil. In English, the word enthralled comes from the same root, meaning captured or held. Today it can sound romantic. Was enthralled by a story, which is one of those linguistic ironies that makes you blink slowly. Words travel, they pick up new meanings, they become gentle. But their roots can be sharp. That's a tiny, oddly specific fact you can let sit quietly in your mind. Like a pebble, language can soften what history did not soften. Now we can let this section drift toward its soft ending without pretending we've resolved anything. Because life after the sale isn't a clean chapter that closes. It's a daily repetition, it's chores, it's social rules. It's where you sleep and what you eat and who is allowed to touch your time. It's the long grindstone of routine, turning again and again. And if freedom ever comes, it often comes not as a sudden moral awakening, but as a slow legal change, dependent on owners, money, luck, and the structure of the society that created the bondage in the first place. But we don't need to force that door open yet. We can simply notice the shape of the household system, how it absorbed people into labor and hierarchy, the way a river absorbs a dropped branch quietly, steadily without asking permission. So for now, let the household settle in your imagination the way a house settles at night. The fire becomes smaller. The tools are put away. The last bowl is rinsed. The floor is swept one more time because crumbs invite animals, and animals are always opportunists. The drafts slip through gaps in wood. People shift on bedding. Someone listens to the wind and thinks about tomorrow's work as if tomorrow will arrive no matter what anyone feels, because it will. And your mind, if it wants to, can let the details blur into a calm hum. Not because the facts don't matter, but because you don't have to hold them with tight hands to remember they exist. You can hold them gently, like a dim lantern in a long hallway, and then set the lantern down for a while, letting the hallway fade, letting the house go quiet, letting the day's routines dissolve into darkness until all that remains is the slow rhythm of breath and the soft, unhurried approach of sleep. You might assume that freedom, once it arrives, would feel like a door swinging wide. A clear sound. A clean step into daylight. But in many old systems, freedom was less like a door and more like a receipt. A document. A careful sentence spoken in front of witnesses who were trying not to look too interested. And in the Viking world, where so much was remembered in law, custom, and quietly repeated practice, freedom could be something you were granted and still somehow not fully given. It could be a label that changed your life and still followed you around like a faint smell of smoke in your clothes. If you're listening somewhere quiet, you can let that slightly strange thought settle in your mind. Where are you, and what time is it for you right now? While we talk about the surprisingly administrative side of being set free. If you're still awake by the time we get to the part where freed can mean free, but with conditions, you can subscribe if you want. Or don't. Either way, the medieval paperwork will continue without our approval, which is both comforting and mildly annoying in Norse society. Some enslaved people could be manumitted, which is a polite word that hides a lot. It means being freed by an owner, sometimes by choice, sometimes for practical reasons, sometimes because an owner wanted to display generosity the way people display expensive jewelry. Freedom might come as a reward for long service, or as part of a deal, or as a final act in someone's will, or as a way to tidy up a household social situation. The point is not that it was common enough to be comforting. The point is that it existed as a possibility, like a small window in a thick wall. But a window is still in a wall. You can see through it. You can feel air. You still can't walk through unless someone opens something for you. The strange, sleepy detail is that the law could recognize freedom in a technical sense while still keeping the free person on the edge of full belonging. In some Norse legal traditions, a freed person could be known by a special category, neither thrall nor fully free in the way a person born free might be. The words vary across regions and centuries, but the feeling is familiar across many societies. You are no longer property, but you are also not quite one of us. That not quite can settle into daily life like dust. It gets into everything. It gets into who you can marry, who will vouch for you, who will share a table with you without acting like they're doing you a favor, and whether your children inherit the shadow of your past like an heirloom nobody asked for. If you want an oddly specific image, imagine a public assembly day, a thing like gathering where disputes are heard. Transactions are witnessed, and society performs itself in daylight. Somewhere in that public space, with voices low and practical, a person's status might be changed with words, witnesses, and a calm sense of procedure. It's not a cinematic scene. It's closer to changing a name on a ledger, and yet the change matters. It matters because status is not only a feeling, it's a social permission slip. It tells other people what they are allowed to do to you and what you are allowed to do back. The system may relax its grip, and that is real. But the hand does not vanish entirely from your memory, and it does not vanish from other people's assumptions. One of the quiet limits of manumission is that it can come with obligations. Freedom can arrive wearing a leash that is simply made of softer material. A freed person might still owe service to a former owner for a time, or owe payments, or owe public loyalty in ways that are hard to measure but easy to demand. Patronage can be a kind of shelter and also a kind of control. It's like being told you may leave the cage, but you should still stay near the person holding the key, just in case. And this is where the system shows its talent for self-preservation. It can offer partial exits without actually weakening itself. It can turn freedom into a managed transition rather than a rupture. If you want a modern analogy that stays gentle, think of how some people leave a job but still feel they must answer emails from their old boss for months. Because the old boss has connections, and the world is small, and no one wants trouble. Now replace emails with social survival. Replace connections with legal standing. Replace the world is small with the entire community knows each other. The analogy isn't perfect, but it shows the sleepy shape of dependence. Dependence doesn't always end with a single declaration. Sometimes it just changes its clothing and keeps sitting in the corner. Another limit is reputation, which is the medieval internet, except slower and more personal. A freed person might still be seen through the lens of their earlier status. People might speak of them as someone who used to belong, as if belonging to a person is a category that never fully washes off. They might face suspicion or pity, or that quiet kind of politeness that feels like someone holding a door open but standing in a doorway so you can't quite pass. They might be accepted in daily interactions but excluded from the deeper layers of community trust. And trust is everything in small societies. Trust decides who helps you in winter. Trust decides who stands with you in a dispute. Trust decides whether someone believes your word, or whether your word needs a witness, or three witnesses, or a witness plus a man with a louder voice. There's also the slow reality that even when a person's legal status improves, the system that produced their enslavement stays in place. The same roots that carried captives can carry captives again. The same households that once relied on coerced labor still prefer cheap labor. The same social logic that treated humans as assets does not evaporate just because one asset is removed from the inventory. It simply fills the space with another asset if it can. That is one of the most chilling things, and we can say it calmly. Improvement for one person does not automatically mean reform of the whole structure. It can mean the structure is flexible enough to allow exceptions while remaining stable. If you want a small, oddly specific detail to anchor you, consider how names and obligations can cling to a freed person. A person might carry a name that marks them, or a story that people repeat, or an association with a household that never fully ends. Even if they move, even if they marry, even if they gain property, people may still remember who once held authority over them. And memory can be as powerful as law. Law can tell you what you may do. Memory can tell you what others will allow you to do without punishing you socially. And social punishment can be subtle. It can be fewer invitations, fewer allies, fewer opportunities to be seen as safe. The village, the port, the farmstead, these are not anonymous spaces. They remember. They remember the way a dock remembers the shape of a ship against its wood. Sometimes the idea of manumission is presented as a soft moral moment, like a clean lesson. Look, freedom happened. But in reality, it could be messy, strategic, and limited. An owner might free someone for religious reasons, or for reputation, or as a display of power, because to free someone is also to show that you had the power to keep them. A gift can sometimes be a performance, and a person receiving that gift may have complicated feelings that the sources rarely record, because sources tend to center the giver. The giver's generosity is narrated. The receiver's interior life is often not, which means we are left, again, with the outline of a system and the faint trace of the human inside it. There's a quiet irony here that's almost too gentle to be called irony. A freed person might still have social marks, names, obligations. The memory of who held authority, and the community can recognize freedom while still keeping the person at the edge of belonging. It's like being invited into a warm room, but asked to stand near the door just in case. And the just in case is never fully explained. It doesn't need to be explained. It's simply there, floating in the background like smoke that won't leave the rafters. If you want another micro hook, notice how often legal systems love categories. Categories are soothing to administrators. Categories make the world feel tidy. Categories also make it easier to treat people as types rather than individuals. A freed person can become a category. A category can become a stereotype. A stereotype can become a shortcut for decision-making. And decision-making is where everyday life happens. Who gets hired? Who gets trusted? Who gets protected? Who gets blamed when something goes missing? A small community can be kind. A small community can also be intensely conservative, not in ideology, but in habit. Habit is a powerful guard dog. It doesn't bark because it has a philosophy. It barks because it recognizes something different. And yet, despite all these limits, freedom still mattered. It mattered in the way breath matters. Even a limited breath is different from none. A freed person could sometimes build a life, sometimes acquire property, sometimes become part of the community in real ways, even if the integration was uneven and conditional. Human societies are never perfectly consistent. That inconsistency can be cruel, but it can also be the crack where life grows. Still, the system stayed ready to replace the gap with someone else, because the trade was not a single event. It was a pattern. It was a machine made of roots, markets, households, and quiet acceptance. So we don't end this with a neat moral bow, because neat bows are usually for stories that want to soothe you into forgetting. Instead, we let it end the way a real tired thought ends softly, without finality. Imagine the coast again, a dock that creaks, a household that settles into night. Somewhere, a person lies down with a new status and an old memory. The law may have changed its word for them, but the world changes more slowly than words. Outside, the water moves the way water always moves, carrying ships, carrying cargo, carrying the same old logic, unless something stronger than habit intervenes. And if your eyes are getting heavy, you can let the details blur without losing their meaning. Let the categories dissolve into the simple rhythm of breath. Let the thought of ledgers, witnesses, names, and quiet limits fade into a dim hum. And for a while, just for now, let your mind rest in the soft darkness where history becomes distant, the dock becomes quiet, and even the heaviest facts can be held gently, then set down, as sleep slowly does its patient, ordinary work. You might think that a trade this large and this human would leave behind something obvious. A single book, a neat set of records, a stamped receipt that says, in clear ink, what happened and when. But the Viking Age is not that kind of world. It is a world where proof often survives as a sideways hint, like the shape a heavy object leaves in grass after it has been lifted away. And that is what makes the record feel both frustrating and strangely intimate. We know it happened, and we can feel the outline of it, and yet the most important voices are the ones we almost never get to hear. If you're listening somewhere quiet, you can let your attention rest on that simple question for a moment. How do we know what we know when the people most affected were rarely the ones holding the pen? And where are you, and what time is it, while we wander gently through the thin, stubborn paper trail of something that was often designed to turn people into a kind of moving cargo? If you're still awake by the time I start talking about tiny metal weights, feel free to subscribe. Or don't. I'm not sure the weights would notice either way. They would just sit there, being small, being heavy, and being annoyingly important. The evidence comes in pieces, and it comes in different moods. Some of it is loud and literary. Some of it is dry and legal. Some of it is silent and buried. The sagas, for example, can feel like they are speaking around the subject rather than into it. They mention people being taken. They mention households with thralls. They mention buying, selling, exchanging, gifting, and inheriting human beings in the same calm breath that they mention livestock, land, and silver. Not because the writers were trying to shock you, but because they were describing a society where this had been normalized, where the practice had become part of the furniture. A saga can casually tell you that someone had thralls, the way someone might casually tell you they had a boat, and you can almost hear the quiet creak of that normality settling in. And then there are the law codes, which have a different kind of voice. Law is rarely poetic. Law is a tool that tries to make messy life behave. When laws name enslaved people, they often do it in the language of property, responsibility, and damage. What happens if a thrall is harmed? What happens if a thrall runs away? What happens if a thrall commits a crime? What happens if a thrall is freed? It is not written to preserve anyone's interior world. It is written to protect the structure that benefits from the arrangement. And in that sense, even a small legal clause can be a kind of confession. The law does not invent problems for fun. It writes down what keeps happening. It writes down what keeps needing to be managed. A soft, oddly specific detail is how many societies make their most disturbing realities feel ordinary by describing them in the tone of routine. You can feel it in the way legal language flattens human life into categories. not because the lawmakers were uniquely cruel in their phrasing, but because law tends to speak like a person who has been doing the same job for too long and wants everything to fit into a box. This is not a dramatic villain voice. It is a tired administrative voice. And sometimes that is the voice that keeps systems alive. Archaeology, meanwhile, gives you the world of objects. And objects are honest in a quiet way. They do not narrate themselves. They simply exist where they are found, and they make you ask why. When you find silver in the ground, chopped into pieces, bent and cut like someone was making change without coins, you are looking at a kind of economic language. People call it hack silver, and it is exactly what it sounds like. Silver treated as weight, not as art. When silver becomes weight, you need scales. When you need scales, you need weights. And the weights that survive are sometimes so small and so plain that they feel almost like a joke. A tiny lump of metal sitting in your palm, quietly telling you that people were measuring value carefully over and over again in daily transactions. The kind of calm repetition that makes a trade system work. And here is where the record becomes a little haunting without needing to raise its voice. Because those same scales and weights were used to measure the value of many things, including human beings. Archaeology cannot always tell you what was weighed in a specific moment, but it can tell you the habits of weighing, the presence of exchange, the infrastructure of commerce. It can tell you that a port town had the tools of trade, that a settlement had imported silver, that a marketplace had evidence of repeated buying and selling. It can tell you that the system was not only raids and romance, but logistics and routines. It is hard to romanticize a scale. It just sits there and does math. There are also chains and shackles and restraints that appear in the archaeological record, though not always in large numbers, and not always in ways that are easy to interpret. A piece of iron can be many things. A ring can be a fastener, a tool, or a restraint depending on context. Archaeology often asks you to be patient with ambiguity, which is honestly a very sleepy skill. You look at an object and you admit calmly that you cannot know everything. You can only know what is likely, what is supported, what matches other evidence. In a way, archaeology teaches you to breathe slowly in the presence of uncertainty, which is a useful practice for bedtime, even when the subject matter is heavy. Foreign chronicles add another layer, because sometimes outsiders notice what insiders normalize. Writers in other regions describe raids, trade, captives, and movement. They sometimes mention people appearing far from home, renamed and resettled. They may describe markets and routes in broad strokes, because they are watching the edges of a system rather than living inside its daily detail. And yet those broad strokes matter. They show that this was not a purely local phenomenon. It connected to wider networks, wider economies, and wider habits of turning humans into value that could be moved. A strangely modern feeling part of this is how often evidence is about movement rather than about feeling, routes, ports, goods, names that change, people who show up in places they did not start. It can feel like tracking packages, except the packages are people. And if you let yourself notice that comparison softly, you can also notice how uncomfortable it is. Modern logistics is obsessed with tracking. Where is it now? When did it arrive? Who signed for it? The past does not give us that level of detail, but it gives us the same underlying shape, a concern with movement, with ownership, with transfer, with proof. Sometimes we know through the absence of voices. That sounds strange, but it's true. The evidence rarely preserves the speech of enslaved people themselves, and that absence is not accidental. It reflects the social arrangement. If you are treated as property, your story is not considered an asset worth preserving. The system does not invest in your narration. And so we read around you. We read the household rules that imply your labor. We read the saga lines that imply your presence. We read the legal categories that imply your vulnerability. We read the archaeological goods that imply the economic rhythms that made all of this feel normal to the people benefiting from it. A micro hook that keeps your mind gently awake is the way tiny, boring things can carry big histories. A small lead weight can be more revealing than a heroic speech. A worn scale can be more honest than a poem. A simple law clause can say more about daily reality than a battle story, because battles are occasional and routines are constant. Slavery in many societies is a routine. That is part of what makes it so enduring. It can hide inside the everyday, inside meals, inside chores, inside the quiet movement of bodies around a farmstead, inside the sound of a dock at night. And then there's language itself, which can be a clue in a fog at the same time. Words like thrall carry meaning, but meaning shifts across regions and centuries. The record uses terms that feel fixed, but the lived experience behind those terms could vary wildly. One person's daily life might be heavy labor and harsh control. Another's might be domestic work, closer to the household center, still coercive, still constrained, but different in texture. The sources rarely pause to explain texture. They assume the audience already knows. That assumption is part of the evidence, too. When a writer doesn't explain, it means the writer expects the reader to recognize the category without effort. There is also the uncomfortable truth that some evidence comes to us through the very people who benefited from the system. The sagas were written down later, shaped by elite perspectives, shaped by storytelling priorities, shaped by what the writers thought mattered. Laws were written to regulate a society, not to critique it. Foreign chronicles were written with their own biases and agendas. Archaeology is more neutral in its voice, but it is limited by what survives and what is found and how we interpret it. And so knowing becomes a careful act. You take a little from here, a little from there. You compare. You cross-check. You resist the temptation to turn it into a neat, satisfying narrative, because neatness can be a kind of lying. If you want a gentle modern analogy, think of how you might reconstruct someone's life from the traces they leave without ever hearing their voice. A few text messages quoted by other people, a bank statement, a lease, a photograph where they're standing just out of frame. You could know they existed. You could know their movements. You could know what they paid for. You might even know what people said about them, but you would still be missing the inside. That missing inside is not just a sad accident. It is a clue about who had the power to speak and who was spoken about. One of the oddest details is how the most boring evidence can be the most reliable. A heroic story might exaggerate. A legal fine is less likely to be invented because someone had to pay it. A weight standard is less likely to be imaginary because trade depends on shared expectations. A hoard of silver buried in the ground is not trying to impress you. It is trying to stay hidden. And yet, even those boring things don't directly tell you what a captive felt stepping onto a dock, or hearing their name change, or realizing that the world had decided they were a category. The record is not kind enough to give us that. So we speak carefully. We don't pretend to know what we cannot know. We acknowledge the shape of the violence without turning it into spectacle. And this is where you can let the pace slow further, because the act of knowing in history is often an act of reading shadows. You see what was built. You see what was bought. You see what was made profitable. You see how roots functioned. You see how households were arranged. You see how law anticipated certain events like escape, punishment, sale, and manumission. You see how trade goods move alongside human movement, and you begin to understand not only individual events, but the underlying system that made those events repeat. If your mind wants a small, specific anchor again, imagine a scribe, not a dramatic scribe, just a tired person with ink-stained fingers, writing down transactions, tallies, and names. Now imagine how easily names can be replaced by categories. One man, one woman, two youths, a household thrall. It is the kind of language that lets a human be carried in a line of text without any friction. That frictionlessness is part of the horror, but we hold it gently because we are not here to shout. We are here to notice quietly how the world can normalize what should never be normal. We also know through contradictions. Sometimes the sources disagree, or they leave gaps, or they present the same practice in different lights. That is not a problem to be solved with a dramatic conclusion. It is simply the nature of the material. The past is not obligated to be neat for us. And when we force neatness, we often end up smoothing away the very parts that matter. So we let the evidence remain a little uneven. We let the corners stay sharp, but we don't press them into the listener's skin. We simply place them on the table and describe them calmly, like objects in a quiet museum room after closing time. And as we drift toward the end of this section, we can hold one last sleepy thought. The record, for all its limits, still tells us enough to refuse the clean myth. It tells us enough to look under the heroic story and see the labor beneath it, the transactions beneath it, the people beneath it. It tells us enough to say, softly and clearly, that the trade existed, that it was woven into the economy, that it was often treated as ordinary, and that the ordinariness is part of the evidence. The silence is part of the evidence too. So let the images fade into something simpler. A small weight resting in the poem, a scale balancing without emotion, a line of law written in careful script, a saga sentence that mentions a thrall and moves on, a foreign note about captives appearing far from home. The pieces don't shout. They just sit there, patient, waiting for someone to notice what they imply. And if your eyes are getting heavy, you can let the implications soften into the background. You can let the objects and the words blur into a gentle hum like the sea against wood, like a quiet archive settling into darkness, like history itself becoming distant enough that your mind can finally set it down for the night. You can tell a lot about a society by what it chooses to store neatly and what it leaves to drift. Grain goes into bins. Silver goes into purses or into the ground when purses stop feeling safe. Stories go into songs. But the parts that don't flatter anyone, those have a habit of being left out on the table like a cup you meant to wash. Later, and then the night got long, and you quietly decided you could live with it until morning. That's one way to think about hard history. It often survives like that cup. Present, ordinary, and somehow still uncomfortably heavy. If you're listening with the lights low, you can let your thoughts move slowly with that idea that there are facts you can put in one jar and myths you put in another. And the trick, sleepy gentle, quietly difficult, is remembering which lid belongs to which jar. Because the Viking age, like most ages, has a talent for becoming a costume, a helmet that wasn't quite shaped like that, a ship that is always perfectly photogenic, a story that ends with glory like a tidy bow, and then beneath that, the less tidy evidence, roots, markets, weights, laws, and the constant human fact that people were sometimes treated like something you could count. If you are still awake by the time we get to the part where we imagine someone trying to calculate a person's value with a scale and a straight face, you can subscribe. Or don't. Either way, the scale remains deeply unimpressed, because scales have never once cared about being liked. A bedtime oath for hard history doesn't need trumpets. It can be quiet, like a promise you make to yourself while closing a book gently so the spine doesn't crack. It's the promise not to turn suffering into decoration and not to turn cruelty into an exciting plot twist. It's the promise to notice what is true without glamorizing it and to keep returning to the plain texture of how things worked. Not because it's pleasant, but because it's honest. And honesty, when handled softly, can be strangely calming. It tells your mind it doesn't have to chase fantasies. It can rest inside what is real, even if what is real is complicated. One small habit that helps is to focus on the boring mechanisms, the quiet engine, the repetitive motions that made the system possible. The way a port has to wake up every day and do its work. The way a boat needs repairs, food, rope, and patience. The way people become paperwork and paperwork becomes permission. The way a market day isn't one dramatic shout, but a series of ordinary exchanges. A hand gesture, a nod, a purse opened and closed, a name shortened, a price agreed upon as if discussing firewood. When you look at the mechanics, the romantic fog thins on its own. A micro hook to keep you gently attentive is that markets don't always look like markets in the way modern imagination wants. Sometimes there is no big square, no dramatic auction platform, no obvious sign that says market. Sometimes it's a dock with a few people standing too close together. Sometimes it's a courtyard. Sometimes it has a back room in a house where the door closes with that soft final sound that means the outside world doesn't need to know. The market can be wherever a transaction can happen, which is a deeply unromantic truth. It's also a very practical one. Humans across time have been excellent at finding locations for whatever they want to do discreetly. The Viking Age did not invent discretion. It just had its own architecture for it. And so part of the oath is this: don't let the clean stories do all the talking. When a tale feels too glorious, pause and ask what it's leaving out. Not loudly, not as a scolding, just as a sleepy habit of mind. Who rode the ship when the hero was busy being a hero? Who cooked and cleaned and repaired and hauled and carried? Who was counted as a person and who was counted as cargo? Sometimes that question is enough to rebalance the room, like opening a window a crack so the air stops feeling too thick. There's also the issue of language, which can be surprisingly slippery for something that looks so solid on a page. Words like thrall can sound almost quaint to modern ears, like a historical term you might see printed in an elegant font. But the lived reality behind the word was not elegant. The word can act like a soft curtain. It makes the concept feel like a category instead of a life. And the oath, if it has another line, is to tug that curtain aside gently, to remember that categories are administrative shortcuts. They are designed to help someone else manage you. They are rarely designed to describe how it felt to be you. Another micro hook is how often freedom is described as a process rather than a moment. In many legal systems, manumission being freed could happen, but it often came with limits and with conditions and with the long aftertaste of social memory. You could be free and still carry marks, obligations, stigma, a changed name, a changed place, a changed relationship to the community. If you want a very quiet modern analogy, think of someone trying to re-enter ordinary life after being reduced to a number by an institution. Even if the door opens, the air outside doesn't instantly feel familiar. The body remembers being managed. The world remembers how it used to speak to you. Freedom can be real and still incomplete. History doesn't always give you clean transformations. The oath doesn't ask you to despair about that. It asks you to notice it without rushing to fix it in your mind with a comforting conclusion. Because conclusions are one of the ways we turn history into a bedtime story with a moral. And sometimes history doesn't hand you a moral. It hands you a system, and it hands you people moving through it, and it hands you the quiet fact that systems can keep going wrong after anyone stops thinking about them. If you let your attention rest on the physical world again, you can imagine the sound of a market in a port town. Not the dramatic kind of sound, but the mixed, ordinary sound. Footsteps on wood, voices in different languages, the dull clink of metal, the scrape of a scale weight against a board. Somewhere maybe a bell sounds once. Not as a celebration, just as a signal and administrative noise. The bell doesn't care what it signals. It only knows it has been rung. It is, in that way, the perfect symbol of how the ordinary can carry the unbearable without changing its tone. A sleepy historian's trick is to hold onto one concrete object as a way to keep the mind from spiraling into abstraction. So let it be a coin, or a fragment of hack silver, worn smooth, the kind of thing that disappears into a palm easily. It's oddly calming to imagine how small the tokens of a large system can be. A piece of metal the size of a thumbnail, representing labor, representing movement, representing the buying and selling of goods, and sometimes representing the buying and selling of people. The token is small, the system is enormous. And that contrast is one of the strangest, quietest facts about human history. There is a gentle kind of irony in how we often want the past to be either noble or monstrous, as if it must fit into one clear mood. But most of the time, it's neither. It's ordinary. People wake up. People eat. People argue. People repair things. People bargain. People complain about weather. People fall asleep. And within that ordinariness, some people are given power, and some people are denied it, and the denial becomes part of the daily schedule. The oath is to resist the temptation to turn this into spectacle. To say, softly, the most chilling detail is often how normal it can feel to the people using it. If you want another tiny microhook, consider the role of renaming. Names are one of the first things that get moved around in systems of control. A name can be shortened because it's too hard. A name can be replaced because the buyer wants something easier to say. A name can be changed because the old one connects you to a place and a family and a history that the system wants to loosen. Renaming is, in a way, a quiet form of inventory management. It makes a person easier to file. And that, again, is the kind of detail that doesn't need drama to be disturbing. It's disturbing because it's tidy. And yet, even here, the oath is not to turn away from the evidence just because it is uncomfortable. It's to hold it gently and clearly, to say, this happened. We know it happened through sagas that mention it casually, through laws that regulate it, through archaeology that shows trade infrastructure, through foreign texts that notice captives moving along routes. We know it happened because the world that produced these sources had reasons to talk around it, name it, or assume it. And we also know the limits. We rarely hear the enslaved speak directly. We rarely get diaries, letters, or confessions from the people being traded. That silence is not a coincidence. It is part of the system. The system does not preserve the voices it does not value. A very quiet modern comparison is the way some workplaces can talk about headcount as if it is a natural unit, as if a person is simply a number in a plan. It's not the same, of course, but the language habit is familiar. Converting lives into units helps systems run smoothly. The Viking Age had its own versions of that conversion, and the record sometimes carries it in a way that feels almost bureaucratically calm. If your mind is drifting, you can let it drift on that idea. That language can make cruelty easier to carry, the way a soft cloth makes a heavy object easier to grip. The oath might also include one gentle instruction for tomorrow, if you're still awake tomorrow. Hold one detail gently but clearly. A market bell is still a bell, even when it sells people. That sentence is not meant to be poetic. It's meant to be plain. It's meant to keep you from romanticizing the setting. A bell is an object. It has a function. It can be used in a church, in a town square, on a ship, at a dock, at a market. The bell doesn't become noble because it's old. It doesn't become innocent because it sounds nice. It simply does what it does. And that's what makes it a good anchor for a hard truth. The ordinary does not wash the act clean. And now, as we begin to drift toward the soft edge of silence, you can return to the image of jars again. One jar for facts, roots, ports, scales, laws, names, transactions. Another jar for myth, ships, heroes, clean stories, the kind of glory that arrives without mentioning who paid for it. The oath is not to smash the myth jar. People need stories. Stories are how humans fall asleep, how they remember, how they make meaning. The oath is simply to label the jars correctly so you don't drink from the wrong one when you're thirsty for truth. If you let your attention loosen further, you can imagine the dock at night. Not a dramatic night, a quiet one. The water darkens. The wood creaks. The wind is a low, patient sound that doesn't care about human categories. Somewhere, a purse rests with coins inside, and the coins, for once, are not moving. They sleep in their little metal pile, as if money itself can finally stop being busy. The bell is silent. The market, for now, is not a market. It's just a place, a piece of shoreline. A few closed doors. A rope coiled neatly, like someone tried to end the day with order. And in that quiet, you don't have to resolve anything. You don't have to make it tidy. You don't have to force a lesson into a satisfying ending. You can simply let the truth be what it is seen, named, held gently while your mind does what minds are allowed to do at night, which is to soften, to blur, to drift. The water keeps its rhythm. The dock keeps its stillness. The coins remain asleep, unimpressed, small and heavy. And the night, very calmly, refuses to romanticize anything at all, as it settles over the harbor like a dark, ordinary blanket that could cover the whole world if you let it.